Esther Vance did not raise her voice when Silas Coyne's rider trotted his cattle straight through her standing wheat. She stood on the porch and watched 40 head break the rows Tom had drilled the spring before he died. The stalks went down under the hooves like they were nothing, like they had never been anything. She did not shout. She did not run. She only pressed her hand flat against the post and felt the wood warm under her palm. And she counted the cattle out to the far fence, one by one. The way you count things you mean to remember. That was the small hurt, the one nobody saw but her. The big one came later, on the Grange-hall steps, in front of 40-odd neighbors who had come for talk of drought relief. Silas Coyne set a deed transfer paper on the porch rail. He set a fountain pen down beside it, neat, like a man laying a fork by a plate. And he looked at her the way a hawk looks at a hen yard, and he said it loud enough for the whole county to carry home. "Sign the farm over or starve, Esther. There's no third road for a woman alone." The room went still. You could hear the wind pushing grit against the clapboards. What Coyne didn't know was what her husband had folded into a coffee tin behind the flour crock the spring before he passed. He didn't know it was there. He didn't know what was written on it. And I'm going to cut away right here, before that tin is ever opened, because the whole story turns on it. If you believe what's taken unjustly never stays kept, this story is for you. Before we go on, if a story about a quiet woman and a loud man moves you, do me one thing. Subscribe so the next one finds you. And comment the town you're watching from, the city, the county, wherever you're sitting tonight. I want to see how far this one travels. Now let me take you back to the beginning and tell it slow, the way it happened. Esther Vance came to the high quarter above Ledger Creek as a bride, Halden County, Kansas. 19 and narrow through the shoulders then, though the years would broaden her. She came in a wagon with a cedar chest and a good iron skillet, and a husband named Tom who had a way of squinting at a piece of ground like he could already see the crop standing on it. They broke the sod together. That's a thing people say now like it's easy. It was not easy. The prairie grass had roots 4 feet deep, roots that had held that dirt down since before there were any Vances anywhere. And the plow bucked and screamed against them. And Tom walked behind it with the reins looped over his shoulders and his hands blistering through the gloves. Esther walked the furrow behind him and knocked the clods and pulled the roots and stacked them to dry for the winter fire. It took them 3 years to break the whole 160. 3 years of their young backs. And in the middle of it, the best thing. Tom witched the spring. He cut a fork of green willow and held it loose in his 2 hands and walked the low ground below the barn, back and forth, patient, like a man reading a page in poor light. Esther watched him from the garden and thought it was foolishness. Then the willow bent. It bent down hard, all on its own, the bark twisting in his fists. And Tom laughed out loud like a boy and drove a stake in the ground. They dug there. 12 feet down, they hit water so cold it ached your teeth. Water that came up on its own and kept coming. And in 30 years, that spring never once failed them. Not in the dry August of 1913. Not in the worst of the war years. Not ever. When the whole county went to hauling water in barrels, the Vance place had water. Cold, clean, rising on its own out of the dark. Tom used to say the spring was the real deed. The paper was just the government's opinion of it. He paid the note off the spring before he died. That's the part I want you to hold on to. There had been a note on the place, $1,850, borrowed from Prairie State Trust over in the county seat, back when they put up the new barn and bought the second team. It hung over them for years, the way a note does. And then one good wheat year, one year the rain came right and the price held, Tom took the last of it into town in a leather pouch and paid it clean off. He walked the paid note home himself, wouldn't let it come by mail. He set it on the kitchen table and smoothed it flat with the side of his hand, and he looked at it a long minute.
Then he did a small thing that would come to mean everything. He took down the coffee tin from behind the flour crock, a dented tin, red once, gone to rust at the seams, and he folded the paid note into it. "There," he said, "we own our dust now." And he put the tin back on its shelf behind the crock where it sat in the shadow. And I swear to you, I never thought about that tin again, not for a long time. It just sat there in the dark, being ordinary. Dust pneumonia took Tom the following March. It came on the black wind. He'd been out in it too long, trying to turn the cattle before a duster, and the dirt got down in his lungs and set up hard. And there was no doctor closer than 40 miles and no rain in the whole sky. He was gone in 9 days. Esther sat with him the whole 9 and held his hand and did not cry where he could see it because he was frightened, and she would not add her fear to his. She saved her crying for after. She had a great deal of it saved up.
She let it out in the barn, alone, with her face against the cold flank of the milk cow. And then she washed her face at the spring and went back to work, because the work does not stop for grief. The work never once stops. So by the summer I'm telling you about, the summer of 1934, Esther Vance was 52 years old and a widow and alone on 160 acres of clear tidal land, with the only live spring in that whole burned corner of the county. Her boy Jonah was 17 and gone. He'd caught on with one of the government road camps, the CCC, up in the north of the state, cutting grade and setting culverts for $30 a month, and 25 of that came home by mail to keep the farm alive. She missed him like a tooth gone out of her head, but the money was real, and the farm ate money the way the drought ate everything else. And so she let him go. And she wrote him letters, and she held on. And she thought this was her blind spot, and I'll be honest with you about it because she was honest with herself about it later. She thought if she just kept her head down and gave nobody any trouble, the trouble would pass her by. She thought quiet was the same as safe. She thought if she endured long enough, the dry years would break and the boy would come home, and it would all come right on its own. She thought stillness would save her. It nearly cost her everything she had. Because a mile and a half east, Silas Coyne had been watching her spring for 2 years. Coyne was 58 and soft in the middle and hard everywhere else. He wasn't a farmer. He'd never broken a rood of sod in his life. He was a landman, a speculator, the paper called him, a baron, the neighbors called him behind their hands. And what he did in a drought was what a certain kind of man always does in a hard time. He bought the hard time.
He went to the courthouse when a widow or a busted homesteader fell behind on the taxes or the note, and he stood at the back with his hands in his pockets, and he bought their ground for the price of the arrears. Dust cheap. He'd taken up better than 6,000 acres that way in 3 years. 6,000 acres of Halden County that had belonged to families, to names, and now belonged to Silas Coyne. But 6,000 acres of Kansas in 1934 was 6,000 acres of blowing dirt. It was worthless without water, and there was exactly one live spring in that whole stretch of ground that never failed. One source that could carry stock and a well and a future through an August. And it did not belong to Silas Coyne.
It belonged to the quiet widow on the high quarter, and that was the one thing in the county he could not buy at a courthouse, because there was no note on it and no back tax owed and nothing for him to buy the debt of. The Vance place was clear, clean, free. He had no lever under it at all, so he decided to make one. He decided to frighten her out. The cattle came first. That was the small offense, the private one, the one with a single witness, and the witness was Esther herself. It was a morning in June, hot already by 7, the sky that hard white it goes when there's no rain in it anywhere. She heard the cattle before she saw them. Coyne's foreman, a lean, sour man named Ridley, drove 40 head straight up out of the creek draw and across the northeast corner where her wheat stood. Thin wheat, drought wheat, but standing, headed out, the only crop she had. He drove them right through the middle of it, not around, through. She came off the porch and walked out to the fence. She didn't run. Ridley sat his horse and watched the cattle spread out over her wheat and pull at it and trample what they didn't eat. And when she got to the fence, he touched his hat brim, all polite, and said, "Creek's low, ma'am. Cattle drift where the feed is." "This is fenced ground," Esther said. "Fence is down." He nodded at it, and it was down, a full panel of it pulled flat, the wire cut clean, though she'd walked that line 2 days before and it had been sound. "Cattle'll do that," Ridley said. "Push right through a weak spot." He touched his hat again and turned his horse and left the cattle where they were, left her to drive them off herself, left her to mend a fence that a knife had cut. She drove the cattle off. It took her the better part of the morning, on foot, an old woman waving a feed sack at 40 head of another man's beef. Then she mended the fence alone. She spliced the cut wire and reset the flat panel and tamped the post, and her hands bled a little on the barbs, and she did not say one word to anybody, because who was there to say it to? She thought, it was an accident. She made herself think that. She was still trying to believe that quiet would save her. It was no accident. It was the first knock on the door. The second knock came to the porch itself, and it came smiling. It was maybe 2 weeks on. Coyne drove up in his automobile, one of the only automobiles in that end of the county, a big dust-gray Hudson, and he got out and took off his hat and came up to the porch like a caller. He had a way about him, courtly. He called her Mrs. Vance and admired the shade of her one surviving elm and said what a shame it was, what the dust had done to everybody, what a hard row it was for a woman on her own. He had a boy with him, a hired boy of hers actually, a slow, easy kid named Dell who did day work for Esther and for half the county. Dell was there fixing the pump handle, and he heard the whole thing, and that mattered later. Coyne got to it gentle. He said he'd hate to see her lose the place. He said the way things were going, the tax sale would take it for nothing inside a year or two, and then where would she be? A woman her age? No man? The boy gone off. He said he'd like to do her a kindness. He'd give her $6 an acre for the whole 160. $960, cash, in her hand. And a seat on the westbound train, he said, warm as pie, before the taxman takes it for nothing and puts you out with empty pockets. $6 an acre and your dignity, Mrs. Vance. That's a fair thing. That's a Christian thing. $960. For 160 acres and a spring that never failed. It was robbery dressed up in a Sunday coat, and they both knew it. And he smiled at her the whole time like he was handing her a gift. Esther looked at him a long moment. She was tired, and it was hot, and part of her, she admitted this later, the honest part of her was scared enough to be tempted. Just for a second, to be done. To take the money and get on the train and not fight anymore. "I'll think on it," she said. That's all she said. "I'll think on it." Which to her meant no, meant leave me be, meant I need you off my porch. But Coyne heard something else. Coyne heard yes. He heard a woman softening. He put his hat back on and said, "You do that, Mrs. Vance. You think hard. I won't hold the offer open forever." And he drove off in his gray Hudson, pleased with himself, certain the fruit was near ripe enough to fall. And Dell, the hired boy, Dell went home and told his people that the Coyne offer was as good as took, that the widow was going to sell. It ran through the county in a week. By the time of the Grange meeting, half of Halden County believed Esther Vance had already sold her place to Silas Coyne, and just hadn't signed the paper yet. That's what made what he did next so bold. He thought she'd already given up. He thought all that was left was to walk her hand to the pen in front of witnesses so it would stick, so there could be no taking it back. He thought wrong, but he didn't know that yet. The Grange-hall meeting was on a Thursday evening, and it was called for an honest reason. The county was trying to put together its list for the federal drought relief, the cattle buy program, the seed loans, and near everybody with ground came in to hear how it would go. The hall was full, 40-odd people, maybe more, on the plank benches fanning themselves with their hats, the men along the back wall. Esther came because everyone came. She sat near the middle in her good gray dress, with her hands folded in her lap. Silas Coyne came too. He came late, on purpose, so the room was full and settled before he walked in. And when the relief business was near done, Coyne stood up in the aisle and asked if he might say a word. And being Coyne, being the man half the county owed or feared, he didn't wait to be told yes. He walked to the front. He had a leather folder under his arm. He set it on the porch rail there at the front of the hall, the low rail before the little platform, and he opened it, and he took out a paper, and he took out a black fountain pen, and he set the pen down beside the paper. Neat, deliberate, so everyone could see. "Neighbors," he said, "you all know the fix we're in. You all know a place can't run on nothing. And you all know Mrs. Vance here has been carrying that high quarter alone since Tom passed, God rest him, with her boy gone off to the government camps." He said it kind. That was the cruelty of it. He said the whole thing kind, so the knife went in soft. "I've made Mrs. Vance a generous offer, more than fair in times like these, and I think, before her neighbors, it'd be a load off her mind to settle it plain." He turned and looked at Esther. The whole room turned and looked at Esther. "So here it is, Esther." He tapped the paper with one finger. "Sign the farm over or starve. There's no third road for a woman alone. Sign it here, tonight, in front of your friends, and take the cash and the train and be shut of the worry. Or hold on out of pride and watch the county sell it off the courthouse steps for the taxes and get nothing, and go to the poorhouse anyway. Those are the roads. There's only the two. Sign or starve." The hall went dead quiet. You have to understand what that was. That was a man standing up in the one gathering place in that whole corner of the world, in front of 40 of her neighbors, the people she went to church with, the people whose children she'd nursed through the fever, and telling her to her face, out loud, that she was already beaten, that she had no say, that her only choices were his money or the grave. He laid it down like it was mercy, and the room believed him, most of them. You could feel it. You could feel 40 people deciding, quietly, in their hearts, that the poor Vance woman was finished, and this was probably the best she'd do. Esther sat with her hands folded. She did not stand up and shout. She did not weep. She did not walk to the rail and take up the pen. She did not do any of the things a person does. She sat there one long moment, and she looked at the paper, and she looked at the pen laid beside it, and then she looked at Silas Coyne's soft, certain, smiling face. And then she unfolded her hands, and she stood up, slow, and she gathered her shawl, and she walked down the center aisle, and out the door of the Grange-hall into the dusk. She never said one word, not one. The screen door clapped shut behind her, and the whole room let out its breath at once. And Silas Coyne stood there at the front, with his deed, and his fine pen, and no signature on either. And for the first time, just for a second, something crossed his face that wasn't certainty. He'd expected tears, or fight, or surrender. He had not expected silence. Silence he couldn't read. Silence he couldn't buy. And it rattled him, just a little, though he covered it quick and made some joke about a woman needing time. And the room laughed, uneasy, and moved on. Esther drove her wagon home in the dark. The team knew the road. She let them take it. Overhead, the stars were hard and close, the way they get when there's no moisture in the whole sky. And the dry wind came across the stubble with that little hiss it makes. And Esther Vance sat on the wagon seat with her spine straight and her jaw set, and did not cry. Something had changed in her on that plank bench. I want to be plain about the moment, because it's the true turn of the whole story. And it wasn't loud. All those years she'd believed that if she gave no offense, took no stand, made herself small and quiet and good, then trouble would find easier prey and pass her by. She'd believed endurance was a kind of armor, and sitting in that hall, watching a man she'd never wronged stand up and try to strip her bare in front of her neighbors, and watching those neighbors half agree, she understood finally in her bones that she had been wrong. Quiet had not saved her. Quiet had marked her. A woman who never pushed back was, to a man like Coyne, simply a thing not yet taken. Her silence hadn't kept the wolf off. It had rung the dinner bell. She was done being quiet in that way. Not loud. She would never be loud. It wasn't in her. But done being still. Done enduring. She was going to plant her feet, and when she got home in the dark, she did not light the lamp and go to bed. She went into the kitchen, and she reached behind the flour crock, and she took down the dented coffee tin that had sat there in the shadow for 1.5 years, untouched since the day they carried Tom out. Her hands shook a little on the lid. It was stiff with rust and grief. She worked it loose. Inside was the paid note. $1,850, marked paid in full across the face, in the bank's own hand. Dated the spring before Tom died. She held it to the window light and read every word. Paid. Clear. She had known it in a corner of her mind, but she had never looked at it, never made it real. And now she made it real. They owed no man $1. There was no note for Coyne to buy. Under the paid note was the deed, the patent to the 160, the government's grant, and the transfer that put it in both their names, Thomas and Esther Vance. And because Tom had been careful, because Tom had always been careful, the survivorship on it that made it hers. All of it hers. Clean and clear, the day he died. No lien, no mortgage, no back tax. It was, in the eye of the law, as free a piece of ground as any in Kansas. It was hers the way your own hand is yours. And under the deed, folded small, was one more thing. A sheet of tablet paper in Tom's blunt pencil. She almost didn't unfold it. When she did, her breath went out of her. It was Tom's own hand, and it said in his plain way, "The spring below the barn, 12 foot to water. Never failed. 1904 to now is the only live water this end of the creek. And don't you ever let it go. With the land, nor apart from it. It is worth more than the ground. And below that, a thing she didn't fully understand yet, but would by morning. See Pruitt at the land office about recording the water. Water can be filed like a claim. First in time is first in right.
We are first.
Esther sat down at the kitchen table with the tin open in front of her and Tom's pencil line in her 2 hands, and she read it 3 times, 4, and something came up in her chest that was half grief and half something else, something hot and clear and steadying, like the first swallow of that cold spring water on an August day. He had known. Somehow, before he died, Tom had known this day might come, and he had left her the map to it, folded up in a rusty coffee tin behind the flour crock, waiting, patient, for the night she was finally ready to open it. She did not put the tin back in the shadow. She set it out on the shelf in the open, lid off, the paid note and the deed standing up in it where she could see them. Then she went to bed, and for the first time since the Grange-hall, she felt her shoulders come down from around her ears, and she slept. In the morning, she hitched the wagon and drove the 11 miles into the county seat to the land office, with Tom's note in her handbag and the deed with it, and she asked for Mr. Pruitt. Wesley Pruitt was a young man, maybe 25, thin, careful, with ink on his fingers and a way of pushing his spectacles up his nose when he was thinking. He was a clerk, just a clerk, the honest kind, the kind that believes the records mean something and that his job is to keep them true. He took Esther's deed and spread it on the high counter and bent over it, and he pulled the county book and matched the numbers, and he did it slow and thorough while she stood there with her heart going. "Mrs. Vance," he said at last, and pushed his spectacles up. "This ground is clear. There's no lien of record, no mortgage. Your taxes are paid current, paid 2 years ahead, in fact. Looks like your husband did that before he passed. There's no back tax owing. There's nothing owing at all. This is as clean a title as I've got in the whole book." He looked at her with a kind of quiet respect. "Whoever's told you you're going to lose this place has told you wrong. Nobody can take a clear title, paid tax homestead. There's no mechanism for it. It isn't possible in law." Esther let that settle into her. Then she took out Tom's pencil note and laid it on the counter and asked the question Tom had told her to ask. "My husband wrote here that I could record the water, the spring. He wrote something about first in time." She looked at the young clerk. "Is that a real thing, Mr. Pruitt? Can a person do that?" Pruitt read Tom's note, and a slow change came over his face. He looked up at her. "Ma'am," he said, "your husband knew his business." He got down a different book, a heavier one. "In this state, water's not automatic with the land, not the way folks think. A live source, a spring, a running claim of water can be filed and recorded as an appropriation, a water right. And the rule is exactly what he wrote here. First in time is first in right. Whoever puts their beneficial use on record first and has used it longest has the senior right. Everybody junior to them stands behind them in a dry year." He tapped the book. "Your spring's been in continuous use since when?" 1904, Esther said. 30 years. It's never once failed. 30 years of continuous, recordable use." Pruitt was quiet a moment, and then he said the thing plainly, the way an honest man says a thing when he's understood it. "Mrs. Vance, if you file and record the senior right on that spring, you become the senior appropriator for this whole stretch of Ledger Creek and the ground it feeds. And I'll tell you what that means, because I don't think you've followed it all the way out yet." He leaned on the counter. Silas Coyne's foreclosed acres, all 6,000 of them. There's no live water on any of them. Not one reliable source. I'd know. It'd be in this book. The only live water this end of the county that carries through in August is yours. Which means the whole value of his holdings, his ability to run stock on them, to prove them up, to borrow against them, to sell them to anybody, all of it leans on getting water. And the only water there is yours. Recorded senior, ahead of him, forever. He straightened up. Without your spring, Mrs. Vance, his 6,000 acres are just dust with a fence around it. Esther stood very still at the counter and understood, all at once, the size of the thing Tom had left her. She had not come in looking for a weapon. She had come in looking for the truth of her own ground. But there it was, plain as the ledger book. She was not the weak thing in this fight. She was the thing the whole other side depended on and could not have. All Coyne's money, all his acres, all his standing up in Grange-halls telling widows to sign or starve, every bit of it was built over a spring that belonged to her, and would belong to her ahead of him for as long as the water ran, if she would only put her name on it in the book. "How do I file it?" she asked. Pruitt got out the form. She was still bent over the counter with a borrowed pen, filling in the description of the spring in her own hand, when the door opened and a man came in, a lawyer, town-dressed, from Coyne's office, who'd evidently been told the Vance woman was in the county seat, and had come to close the sale everyone thought was as good as done. He didn't see the water form. He saw the widow at the counter, and he thought she'd come to town to give up. He was smooth about it. He said Mr. Coyne wanted to spare her the whole ordeal, the tax sale, the worry, the neighbor's pity. He said he had the cash offer right there in his case, ready to lay down on the barrelhead, and a clean bill of sale she could sign this very afternoon and be free of all of it. And Mr. Coyne would even see to moving her things. Cash on the barrelhead, today. Just sign. Esther straightened up from the counter. She looked at the lawyer, and she looked at Wesley Pruitt, standing quiet behind the counter, with his hand resting on the county book. And something in her was steadier now than it had been in a year and a half. "Tell Mr. Coyne," she said, calm as still water, "that I thank him for his trouble, and I'm not selling. Not today, not for cash on the barrelhead, not at any price." She turned back to the counter and to the form in front of her. "I've got a little business of my own to finish here first." The lawyer stood there a second, not understanding. Then his eyes dropped to the form under her hand, to the printed word across the top of it, a word he'd have known, a word any landman's lawyer would know, cold. And she watched him read it, and she watched him go pale, and she watched him understand what she was doing at that counter, before Coyne ever would. He left without another word. He left fast. And Esther Vance turned back to Wesley Pruitt and finished writing her name, in her own clear hand, on the senior water right to the only live spring in Halden County. While a mile and a half east, Silas Coyne sat in his fine gray Hudson, certain as sunrise that the fruit was about to fall, with no idea in the world that the ground had just moved under all 6,000 of his acres, and that the quiet woman he'd told to sign or starve had just, without raising her voice, without a lawyer, without a threat, put her hand on the one thing that could bring the whole of it down to dust. Esther drove the mile and a half home with the certified papers flat on the seat beside her, held down by her glove so the wind through the cracked window couldn't take them. The Hudson was gone from her yard when she came up the section road. Coyne's dust-gray car had pulled out sometime while she was at the counter. She was glad of it. She wasn't ready to see his face yet, and she wanted the tin back on the shelf first. She carried it in. The dented coffee tin, red once, rusted at the seams. She set it on the kitchen shelf beside the flour crock. But this time, she left the lid off, open. The paid note inside, and the deed, and Tom's pencil line about the spring, and now the fresh copy of the water right folded in with them. She stood and looked at it a while. Then she put the kettle on and watched the light go long across the formica. That was the whole of what she did. She did not write to a lawyer. She did not tell a soul in town. She had put her name on the one paper that mattered, in her own clear hand, and now she meant to plant her feet on her own ground and wait. The waiting did the work for her. It started the way these things start, small and far off, like weather you can smell before you see. Word came around by the middle of that week that Prairie State Trust had sent a man down from the city to look at Silas Coyne's books. Not to lend, to look. Dell, the slow hired boy, heard it at the feed store and brought it out to her while he mended the fence Coyne's cattle had cut, and he said it low, like it was a wonder. "They say his note's come due, Miss Vance," Dell told her. "The big one. On all them acres he foreclosed off folks." Esther kept coiling wire. "How big?" $38,000. Dell said the number like it was a thing that couldn't be real. Borrowed back when wheat was fixin' to be $1 a bushel. Esther straightened up. She looked east toward the long, dry rise where Coyne's 6,000 acres lay under a sky the color of old tin. Wheat was 41 cents that week. 41. She did the sum without wanting to. $38,000 of note against 6,000-odd acres of ground that couldn't grow the price of the seed you put in it. "He can't make that," she said. "No, ma'am," Dell said. "I don't reckon he can." She went back to the wire, but something had settled in her chest that hadn't been there the day before. Not gladness, exactly. She wasn't a woman who could take gladness out of another soul's ruin. It was more like the feeling you get when you've set a stone in a wall, and it holds true. She had set her stone. Now the world was leaning on it. The days after that ran along two roads at once, and she watched both. On Coyne's road, everything dried and cracked. The bank man stayed a week and left without shaking Coyne's hand. A boy at the depot saw it and told it all over town. Then the wind came. It came out of the southwest on a Tuesday, a low brown wall you could see coming from the county line, and it scoured across the flat all afternoon and into the dark. When it lifted, one whole section of Coyne's ground, a good quarter he'd taken off a family named Reddick 2 winters back, had blown clean down to hardpan. The topsoil that folks had broke their hearts making was gone east on the wind, and what was left was a gray floor a plow couldn't bite. And it took Alma Whitfield's old quarter with it. That one landed on Esther different. Alma Whitfield was a widow like herself, older, gentle, a woman who'd baked for the whole township at threshing time before the dust and the bank between them turned her out. Coyne had taken Alma's quarter for back taxes 2 years gone, and Alma had gone to live in a rented room over the harness shop in Ledger Creek with nothing but what she could carry. Now, the ground that had broken Alma's heart to lose had blown away in an afternoon, worth nothing, keeping nobody. It was a hard thing to look at. It taught Esther something she carried the rest of her days, that a man like Coyne didn't gather land to hold it. He gathered it to squeeze it, and when the squeeze was done, the land was as ruined as the people he'd took it from. On Esther's road, that same stretch of days, the world was quietly kind. Her spring held. Through the worst August in a decade, through weeks the thermometer on the porch post never dropped below 100, The spring Tom had witched 30 years before ran cold and steady out of the rock the way it always had. She dipped the stock tank full every evening, and it filled again by morning. Her 40 head kept their flesh when half the county's cattle were going to the government buyers at $16 for the sound ones and a bullet for the rest. Her kitchen garden, watered from that spring by the bucketful, stayed green as June, tomatoes and beans up the poles, and the squash running fat along the fence line, while a mile and a half east the ground turned to powder. Then the letter came from Jonah. She knew his hand on the envelope before she had it off the mail hook. 17 years old and away at a CCC road camp near the state line, laying gravel and cutting grade for $30 a month, and 25 of that came home to her every month like clockwork, because that was the boy Tom had raised. This time the letter had the money folded inside it, his first wages, the whole 25 in worn bills, and 3 lines in pencil that said he was strong and eating regular, and that a man in his crew had a paper that said the drought was breaking in the west, and he'd believe it when he stood in the rain. She sat down at the Formica table with the bills in her hand and cried a little. The good kind. The kind that doesn't ask anything of you. Then she dried her face and drove to town and paid the season's seed money down at the co-op, cash, and asked for the receipt in her name. Everything in her name now. She was learning to like the sound of it. Coyne came the last week of August. She heard the Hudson before she saw it, that big, soft motor coming up the section road slower than it had ever come before. She was on the porch shelling the last of the peas into a bowl in her lap, and she did not get up. She watched the dust-gray car roll into her yard and stop, and she watched Silas Coyne climb out of it, and she saw right away that he was a changed man. The Baron was gone out of him. He was 58, and he'd always carried it like a much younger man, straight-backed, chin up, the gray suit pressed and the watch chain shining. Now the suit hung on him. He'd lost flesh in the face. There was a gray tiredness under his eyes that no razor could shave off, and when he came across the yard toward her porch, he came with his hat already in his hands, and that told her everything before he said a word. A man like Coyne didn't take his hat off to a widow he meant to command. "Mrs. Vance?" he said. "Mr. Coyne?" He stood at the bottom of her steps. He turned the hat around by the brim, once, twice. "You'll have heard, I expect. Folks talk." "I've heard some." "Then you'll know my position isn't what it was." He said it plain, the way a man says a hard thing he's practiced in the car on the way over. "I've got a note come due at Prairie State, a large one, and I find myself needing to speak with you, not as I spoke before." He looked up at her then, and there was something in his face she'd never seen on it, a kind of naked figuring, a man adding up his own ruin in front of a woman he'd told to sign or starve. "I owe you an apology for the Grange-hall. I'll say that first, so it's said." "All right?" He waited, maybe, for her to soften. She didn't. She kept shelling peas, and the small sound of them dropping into the bowl was the only sound in the yard. "I've come to make you an offer," Coyne said. "A fair one this time, an honest one. I'll buy your quarter section at a real price, not the 6 an acre I named on this porch in the spring. I'm ashamed of that figure now. A real price, top of the market, cash, and you name it, and I'll try to meet it." He turned the hat again. "And if you won't sell the ground, and I understand a woman's feeling for her ground, I do, then I'd ask to lease the water. Just the spring. A yearly sum, generous, paid in advance, for the right to run a pipe off your spring to the sections east. It would save 6,000 acres, Mrs. Vance. It would save me. I'm asking you plain. I'm asking you as one soul to another." And there it was. The whole of it laid out on her porch steps, hat in hand, the man who'd driven his cattle through Tom's wheat, who'd stood on the Grange steps before 40-odd neighbors and told her there was no third road for a woman alone, now standing in her yard, begging for a pipe and a lease and a chance. Esther finished the pod in her hand. She set it in the bowl. Then she looked at him, and when she spoke, her voice was as level and cool as the water they were talking about. "Mr. Coyne," she said, "you drove your cattle through my wheat in the spring, and your foreman told me the creek was low and cattle drift. You came up on this porch and offered me $960 for 160 acres and a seat on the westbound train. You stood on the Grange steps in front of my neighbors and laid a pen on the rail and told me to sign the farm over or starve." She stood up now, the bowl of peas against her hip, and she was not a small woman, and she did not raise her voice. "And now you've come to ask me for the water." "I have," he said. "I won't pretend otherwise." "The water was here before you, Mr. Coyne." She looked past him, east toward his dust. "It was here before Tom and me. It'll be here after the both of us. You can't foreclose on rain you never made, and you can't buy a spring off a woman by threatening her and then asking her nice when the threat comes back on you." She stepped to the edge of the porch. "I filed a paper at the land office. A senior appropriation, they call it. It means the water's mine, in law, first in time and first in right. And no pipe runs off it that I don't say runs off it. I'm not selling you the ground. I'm not leasing you the spring. I'm not signing anything at all. I signed the one thing I meant to sign, and it's done, and it's recorded, and it can't be undone." Coyne stood very still. She watched the last of it go out of him, the last hope he'd carried up the section road that he could talk or buy or beg his way back onto solid ground. His shoulders came down. He put his hat on, slow. "You filed the water," he said. It wasn't a question. It was a man saying out loud the thing that had killed him. "The spring before you ever came," Esther said. "My husband walked the paid note home and told me we owned our dust now. He left me a line in pencil about that water. He knew what you were before you did, Mr. Coyne. He just didn't live to see it." She stepped back from the rail. "Good day to you." He didn't answer. He turned and walked back to the Hudson with his hat on and his back not straight anymore, and he drove out of her yard slow, and she stood on the porch with her bowl of peas and watched his dust go east and settle. Then she went in and finished supper. She thought that was the end of him. It wasn't, quite. A cornered man has one more turn in him, and Coyne took his the second week of September. She found the notice nailed to her own front gate on a Thursday morning. A printed bill, official-looking, the kind the county posted for tax sales, and it named the Vance quarter, her quarter, 160 acres above Ledger Creek, for public auction on the courthouse steps the following month, for back taxes claimed owing. $1,800 and some, it said, owed and unpaid, sold to the highest bidder to satisfy the debt. It was a lie. She knew it was a lie the moment she read it, because she'd stood at Wesley Pruitt's counter and heard him say her taxes were paid 2 years ahead. But it was a lie with the county's own look to it, nailed to her gate for every neighbor on the road to see, and she understood the shape of it right off. Coyne couldn't buy her and couldn't lease her, so he'd bought somebody at the courthouse instead, greased a false claim into the tax book, posted it public, and hoped to run her off her ground under the color of law before she could untangle it. And the wind came again that same week, like the thing was ordered. A black duster, worse than August's, and it laid her standing wheat flat and buried the fence rows and left the whole quarter looking dead as Coyne's own hardpan. That was the low night. She'll not deny it, and she never did when she told it after. She sat that night at the Formica table with the false notice smoothed out flat in front of her and the lamp turned low, and the wind still moaning at the eaves. And for the first time since the Grange-hall, she was afraid. not of Coyne, of the town, of the slow machinery of a county that had watched her humiliated on the Grange steps and said nothing, and might just as easy watch her sold off her ground and say nothing again. She was one woman, 52 years old, alone in a farmhouse with a dead husband's coffee tin open on the shelf. And she thought, for the length of that one bad night, that being right might not be enough, that a lie nailed to a gate might carry the day just because it was nailed there bold. But morning came, the way it does, and Esther Vance did the thing Tom's whole life had taught her to do. She got up, and she washed her face, and she took the coffee tin down off the shelf, and she drove to the county seat with the deed and the paid note and the certified clear title on the seat beside her, held down under her glove. Wesley Pruitt read the notice she laid on his counter, and his young face went from puzzled to angry in about 4 seconds flat. "This is false, Mrs. Vance," he said. "This is flat false. Your taxes are paid through next year. I entered it myself." He turned and pulled the county tax ledger down and opened it on the counter between them and put his finger on the line. "There, Vance quarter, paid. There's no lien on your ground. There never was." "Somebody wrote one," Esther said. "Then somebody's going to answer for it." Pruitt was already reaching for his hat. "Wait here." He came back inside a quarter hour with Sheriff Ott Barlow, a big, slow, deliberate man who'd known Tom Vance and who'd made it plain more than once that he'd not be any land speculator's hired muscle. Barlow read the notice. He read the ledger line Pruitt kept his finger on. He looked at the certified title Esther laid beside it. Then he took the notice up off the counter, folded it in half, and put it in his coat pocket. "This come off your gate?" he asked her. "This morning." "Who nailed it there, you know?" "No." "I expect I can find out." Barlow's voice was quiet, and it had iron in the bottom of it. "This is a forged instrument, Mrs. Vance. A false claim entered against clean title. That's not a thing a county overlooks. Your ground's not for sale, and it never was. And I'll have that notice torn off every post it's nailed to by tonight. And I'll have a word with whoever entered it." He looked at Pruitt. "Won't be hard to trace. A man doesn't slip a lien into a public book without leaving his hand on it." It ended in a sentence in the end. The whole of Coyne's last play, the thing she'd sat up all night afraid of, the auction notice and the false $1,800. It ended when a young clerk put his finger on a ledger line and a slow sheriff folded a paper into his pocket. The certified clear title did what Tom had meant it to do the day he folded the note into the tin. It made her unmovable. Paper against paper, and hers was true. The notice came down off the gates that day, and the man Barlow traced it to, a clerk in the assessor's office who'd taken $40 to slip the false line in, gave up Coyne's name inside the hour, which did Coyne no good at all, because by then Coyne had troubles that made a forged tax lien look like nothing. Prairie State Trust called his note. They called it the last week of September, in full, $38,000 against 6,400 acres. And they called it because a bank in a drought is a frightened animal, and Coyne's ground was worth less every day the wind blew. He went to them to refinance. He had the meeting Esther heard about later from 3 different people who each had it from someone who'd been near the door. He laid out his sections on the banker's desk and asked for time, for a new note, for anything. And the bank president, a careful city man who'd sent his own agent down to look, asked him one question. He asked about the water. Because a banker isn't a fool, and word of a recorded senior appropriation travels through a land office, and a courthouse, and a bank faster than any wind. And Coyne had to sit in that chair and say it out loud a second time, the thing that had killed him on Esther's porch. that the only live spring feeding all 6,000 acres was recorded, in law, to the widow Vance, first in time and first in right, and that she would not sell it, and would not lease it, and would not run a pipe off it for any sum on earth. 6,400 acres with no water a bank could count on. Dry ground in a dry year, secured against a note wheat at 41 cents, could never pay. No bank in the state would refinance that, not a dollar of it. So the same instruments Silas Coyne had used to gather his empire, the note, the lien, the foreclosure, the machinery of debt he'd run against widow after widow across Halden County, closed its jaws on him. Prairie State Trust foreclosed on Silas Coyne, and it went, like these things go in a county too small to hide anything, to the courthouse steps and the public auction. Only this time it was Coyne's 6,000 acres on the block, and not one soul's quarter that he'd taken. Esther went. She hadn't meant to. It was Alma Whitfield, of all souls, who talked her into it. Alma, who'd come out to help her put the garden by for winter, who said in her gentle way that a woman ought to see the wheel come all the way around when it was her own hand that had set it turning true. So they drove in together, the two widows, and they stood at the back of the crowd on the courthouse lawn on a bright, cold October morning, while the auctioneer read the descriptions off the sale bill. Half the county was there. She saw the Grange faces, the same 40-odd neighbors who'd stood silent on the steps and watched Coyne lay a pen on the rail in front of her. They weren't silent now. They stood in a loose crowd with their trucks nosed in along the square, and there was a low sound coming off them. Not a cheer, nothing so coarse as that, just the murmur of a whole township watching a scale it had thought fixed come level at last. And it drew dust cheap. That was the thing. The auctioneer would read off a good half section and call for bids, and the bids would come slow and low, because every man on that lawn knew now what the bank had learned, that the water stayed with Esther Vance, that 6,000 acres without her spring was 6,000 acres of blowing dust, and a man would be a fool to pay more than tax value for the right to watch it drift east. Section after section went for dimes on the dollar to a scatter of cautious buyers and the bank's own account. The empire Coyne had built out of other people's ruin came apart on the block for less than the notes he'd taken it under. Coyne stood alone. He stood off to the side of the courthouse steps, on the very steps, near enough to the top that Esther marked the irony of it without a word. The same steps. His lawyer had withdrawn. Folks said he'd not been paid, and had taken the westbound himself the week before. His foreman, Ridley, the lean, sour man who'd driven the cattle through her wheat and cut her fence and shrugged that the creek was low, had walked off the place a month back for wages that never came, and he was in the crowd now like any other man, watching, saying nothing. The bank president stood on the lawn with his papers and would not once look up at Coyne on the steps. Nobody would. A man can stand in a crowd of 200 souls and be more alone than a man in a desert. And Silas Coyne stood that way while the auctioneer sold his ground out from under him a half section at a time. He found her in the crowd. His eyes went over the faces and stopped on hers, and for a long moment across that October lawn, the two of them looked at each other, the baron and the widow, the man who'd told her to sign or starve, and the woman who'd signed nothing. She didn't smile, she didn't nod. There was nothing in her to gloat with, and she found, looking at him, that she pitied him a little, the way you'd pity any creature that had starved itself hunting a thing it was never going to be able to keep. He was the one who looked away first. He looked down at the steps under his own shoes, and then he turned and went down them, and through the crowd that opened to let him pass, and did not say a word to him, and he was gone. Wesley Pruitt was standing near her by then. He'd come out of the land office to see it, the way half the courthouse had, and he stood beside the two widows with his hands in his coat pockets and watched the last of the sections go. "They say he's leaving," Pruitt said quietly. "Got a room let over in the city. Nothing to hold him here now." Esther watched the place where Coyne had gone through the crowd. "No," she said, "I don't reckon there is." And that was the whole of her karma on him, spoken to a young clerk on a courthouse lawn, no louder than a woman naming the weather. She said one dry thing, and only one, and she said it not to Coyne and not to the crowd, but just to Wesley Pruitt, standing there beside her, quiet, the two of them looking at the empty steps. "He wanted paper," Esther said. "I had paper." That was all. She turned and she took Alma Whitfield's arm, and the two widows walked back across the square to the truck, through neighbors who nodded to her now and touched their hats, and a few who said her name, "Miss Vance, Miss Vance," the way you say the name of somebody the whole town has quietly decided to be proud of. She nodded back to every one of them. Then she drove Alma home, and she drove herself home, the 1.5 miles east and up the high quarter above Ledger Creek, to her own ground that was still entirely hers. It was a year later that Tom's rain finally came. The drought broke that next spring the way Jonah's crewman had said it would, in long, slow, soaking rains that walked up out of the west and greened the whole country. And Esther Vance took a wheat crop off the high quarter that fall that would have made Tom weep to see it. She stood in it at harvest, in the tall gold of it, and she thought about the man who'd broken the sod for it 30 years before, and witched the spring that had carried them all through, and she was not sad. She was full. There's a difference, and by then she knew it. They held the harvest meeting on the Grange steps that year, the way they always had, and Esther Vance went, and she stood on the very step where Silas Coyne had laid down a deed and a fountain pen, and told her before 40-odd neighbors that there was no third road for a woman alone. Coyne wasn't on the platform. He wasn't anywhere in Halden County. Folks said he was at the depot that very morning, over in the county seat, with one grip and a hat, buying a seat on the westbound train. The same westbound seat he'd once offered to buy her, back when he was the baron and she was the widow he meant to move. He bought his own this time. He rode it out alone. And his 6,000 acres lay east under the new grass in other men's hands, and his stolen sections had gone back to the bank as the dust they'd become. And the widow Alma Whitfield he'd turned out over the harness shop was living warm in Esther Vance's spare room, wintering over, baking again for threshing crews, the reward for the kept and the fall of the grasping, in the same green season. She never gloated in the year that followed, or ever. When folks would try to make her say a hard word about Coyne, she'd only say the man had starved himself, chasing water he could have asked for honest at the start, and been given, most likely, if he'd come as a neighbor and not a baron. What a man starves for, she'd say, is never quite the same as what he loves. And a thing you never had gives you no right to keep it. That was as much sermon as Esther Vance ever preached, and she preached it soft, over a cup of coffee, to whoever was sitting at the Formica table. The tin sits on the mantel now. She took it down off the kitchen shelf that first good year and gave it a place of honor, the dented old coffee tin, red once, rusted at the seams, open, the way she'd left it since the night she finally understood what Tom had folded into it. Above the mantel, in a plain wood frame, she hung the paid note, $1,850, marked "Paid in Full" in the bank's own hand, and beside it, the clear deed with both their names on it, and beside that, the recorded water right in her hand alone. Framed together, the three papers, the whole of what one quiet man left one quiet woman, and the whole of what it took to keep it. In the mornings, the light comes across the plain kitchen and lays gold on the Formica, and the windmill turns slow out the window over a stock tank that's full to the lip, from a spring that's never once failed a dry August in 31 years now. Jonah's home from the camp, grown tall and steady, walking the green quarter at first light the way his father used to. Checking the fence, Coyne's cattle broke. The fence that's whole now, all of it whole. All of it theirs. Alma's in the kitchen, humming over the stove. And Esther Vance stands in her own doorway with a cup of coffee gone cool in her hand and looks out over 160 acres of ground that a man once told her to sign over or starve. She signed nothing. She held it all. And she kept it not by raising her voice, not with a lawyer, not with a threat, but by putting her hand one time on the one true paper and refusing, calm as still water, to lift it off again. If you're watching this from a small town where the water still runs and the ground is still yours, comment your city below. I want to see how far this one travels.